you. Perfection doesn't exist in nature. Despite our daily...
Speaking about yourself?
Absolutely. Despite our daily efforts, accidents happen. They happen also when we talk about our business. A few weeks ago, we observed a data breach, which, by the way, significantly affected the market value of the supplier stake and of the customer stake. Here we have today Peter Bullock. I invite him to join the floor. Please, Peter. Peter is partner with the international law firm Pins & Masons, and he knows very well the region because he has been living in Hong Kong since 1997, correct?
Yes.
Before you started working with Pins & Masons in London. You are head of the firm's technology and dispute resolution practices for Asia Pacific, and your team also deals with IT merger and acquisition, licensing, intellectual property enforcement, and trademarks. He will tell us something about how to manage the fact that we are not able to be perfect, especially when we speak about the cyber data breaches. Thanks, Peter.
Thank you very much, Enrico. And good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Cybersecurity has recently become a very hot topic, and there are various approaches that I could perhaps take this morning as to how to deal with it. I could start with some scare stories. Certainly no industry is immune from these risks, and seemingly these risks coming into play. But ultimately that's not very useful. I could, as I've done in the past, take a legally forensic exercise of notification requirements in the event of a breach and compare and contrast the legal responses necessary. That is quite a dry topic, and it is rather bewildering how unjoined up different jurisdictions are. But what I've chosen to do is to rather take a helicopter view of a suggested risk management approach. So by way of an agenda, first of all we need a bit of an awareness what it is that we're talking about. Then, most importantly, preparedness. How can we prepare for what's coming up? You then need a checklist of do's and don'ts, perhaps how to do it pre and post incident. And a key element of all of this is reputation and reputation management. And sometimes this element rubs up against legal and compliance, and they seem to work against each other. But it's certainly of paramount importance, as we've seen time and time again, for any customer-facing business. And finally, clean-up, getting back to normal. So, what are we talking about? We're talking about intentional, unintentional and collateral data breaches. On the intentional side, we have script kiddies who are unskilled, pretty much unskilled, often very junior guys downloading hacking tools and seeing what happens when they press the button. We have zero-day bugs, undisclosed computer application vulnerabilities where people who either have planted them or just realized that they're there are holding entities to ransom, or in perhaps extreme cases simply executing them. We have activists such as Anonymous, instilling denial of service attacks for their own motives, sometimes difficult to understand the motives, but certainly they play into the reputational side, and you have to be extremely careful to try and track and avoiding annoying the right people, the wrong people. Then there's industrial espionage. The head of GCHQ in the UK said industrial espionage is being undertaken on an industrial scale. Of course, there should be another bullet there: organised crime. Very sophisticated, seemingly always ahead of the game, and a surprisingly large contributor to these attacks and losses. On the unintentional side, it's nearly always human frailty of one type or another. You either have a fat finger, you have unencrypted USBs being taken home by diligent but overworked workers, you have insecure workstations, and you have lax practices all around the world. Every day you can see them. And then, even if you have managed to set up the best practices you possibly can in your own environment, your own enterprise, you have collateral damage from disturbance within your supply chain. Any of the above happening to a third party in your supply chain can cause you almost as much damage, including reputational damage, as those who are primarily being affected. And then you can start to spin the numbers. You can look at connected risks, and you can look for a doomsday scenario. And that is what the Cambridge Centre for Risk Studies set out to do, to inform the insurance industry as to how bad this could get. And there is something called the Civil Logic Bomb Cyber Catastrophe Model, which set out to model something around civil was simply the name that they gave for the project. The collateral losses that could be triggered by one significant event in the wrong place at the wrong time. In the worst case, they came up with a 5-year loss of $15 trillion, which would be bigger than the 2008 financial crisis. And of course, if it were an insured event, would clearly take out much of the insurance industry. And that has attracted quite a lot of interest in the insurers, many of whom have walked a long way away from coverages, which is perhaps not helpful. And this, of course, is not Y2K. I remember preparing for Y2K as a fresh-faced technology lawyer in Hong Kong, thinking, well, this will be it. This is my gold mine. And of course, the only similarity with Y2K is that the board can understand it. The thing about Y2K was that it was the first, seemingly, the first technological threat, if you like, that the board could get its head round. Now, I hope this is a bit of a testament to boards that since then there's been such an improvement, and CIOs have risen to the board in a way that, frankly, they were not really. They were one or two rungs below the main board back at Y2K. But unlike Y2K, this is an ongoing and not a one-off threat, and it's real and it's escalating. Now, my firm, a couple of years ago now, did a bit of an analysis, and of course this is arguable, but we did it with good intentions, of course, trying to map the overall impact and the cost and the likelihood of the various relative sorts of incidents. And the size, roughly speaking, of the disk correlates to the amount of financial loss caused. Of course, it's not only financial loss, that the reputational side is almost incapable of valuation. So lost memory stick may happen reasonably frequently, had a medium impact, and a relatively modest but inconvenient price tag. Of course, a malicious third-party hack can cause the brick wall to fall down, and it's surprisingly likely to happen. On a bottom-up basis, if that's preferable, $88 per item of data loss is the figure that we've seen quoted. So these are all substantial potential losses when the number of data items are added up. Now, regulators are starting to wake up to all of this, of course. You have to satisfy your regulators, otherwise you get slapped wrists. It may not immediately be a reputational issue, but it may be a problem for you at renewal time. Now, the Hong Kong Monetary Authority, as recently as the 15th of September, wrote to all the CEOs of all authorised institutions in Hong Kong and attached a document which they entitled A Credible Benchmark of Cybersecurity Controls. And this was supposed to point to international standards and other guidance for cyber response. And with perhaps a measure of understatement, there was a hint that cyber presents significant challenges, in the words which were used: certain conventional risk management philosophy and controls practiced by AIs might need to be adjusted or enhanced to cope with the risks. I would say again that that's an understatement, perhaps. The HKMA then went on to highlight 4 areas for cybersecurity risk management, and essentially they were trying to ensure that a holistic approach was used to this problem. So the first area was that there should be risk ownership and management accountability, and it's not just the IT department but all relevant business lines, and this would probably require a cultural shift in many organisations. The second area was a requirement for periodic evaluations and monitoring of cyber security controls, understanding that given the evolving nature of cyber attacks, this is very much a moving target. And as Andrew Jennings mentioned this morning, there is no point trying to take an isolated approach to this. The HKMA encouraged industry collaboration and contingency planning with intelligence sharing. This is not a situation where a proprietary response is appropriate or helpful. In reputation terms, no one can trade off a claim that we don't get hacked like our competitors do. A, it's unattractive, B, it's very short-sighted, and C, it'll probably invite the attention of the hackers anyway by doing that. So collaborative approaches are very important. And the final area that the HKMA has recently offered up is the need for regular independent assessment and tests, not just relying on in-house expertise, but probably calling in outsiders for penetration tests in terms of the banks. Now we move on to preparedness. Of course, my message is that you need to involve the whole team, and that you probably need a cultural shift. And as lawyers, I'm a lawyer, as you've been told, I think, we deal essentially with general counsel. And we think that there are very good reasons why the legal function should be the one to coordinate. It does depend on how strong the legal function is in your organisation. It's possible that compliance should lead, but anyway, take this as the lawyer's view. So the legal function in the middle is coordinating and trying to keep things on track, using the information security and IT people, of course, human resources, PR, compliance and risk, pulling together an incident response team, working with the board, and then coordinating so that the market knows what you're doing. And we do suggest preparedness by developing through simulation exercises. I can give you further details on this sort of thing, but the first stage would be preparation and fact-finding, both for those who's facilitating it, which in our case would be us, and of course yourselves at probably at the GC level. And then stage 2 is designing and tailoring realistic hypothetical simulation exercises. Now effort put in here is absolutely vital. allow the internal teams to prepare for the exercise, and I'll show some step plans later, and then play out what they come to the simulation with. So help them prepare, and then when they think they've got it as they would like it, then you start the simulation. Stage 3 is the simulation exercise itself. You get the incident response team together, give them limited details of what the threat is, and then further information by way of injects as you go through the morning or whatever it is. Possibly do it in the middle of the night, that would be helpful, wouldn't it? But that's when it's probably going to kick off, over perhaps 2 hours or so. It might be a bit staid for the first 5 or 10 minutes, but afterwards it usually livens up. And of course, stage 4 is reporting and gap analysis. What happened, what could have been done better, lessons learned, and most importantly, the actions to be taken to improve the response and to get it better next time. Now, here you need to take systematic pre-incident approach. That may take quite a long time. It would be sensible if you're going to go through to a simulation that you try and do this beforehand, otherwise you'll fall flat on your face. If your people are indeed resistant to doing this, then you put them into the simulation and they will fall flat on their face. Post-incident best practice, the first 5 bullets here are going to be needed to be done within the first 48 hours. Clearly in the simulation that's going to be compacted, but in real time this has got to be mostly done in the first 48 hours. So back to the pre-incident best practice. I won't go through all of it, you can read it, but it's generally reviewing your policies, your documents, and collecting everything together and checking that it's consistent within itself and that it doesn't drop the ball at any obvious point. You need an asset register for your information assets, attributing values to those. It may very well be that you keep vital data unnetworked, for example. That may be the best way of just keeping it under lock and key rather than sticking it onto the network. Consider cyber insurance and review your contracts with your counterparties. So that's the approach that we would suggest. Now, the reason why the analysis and preparation stage is so involved is because data nowadays doesn't stand still. You need to understand fully where and when does your customer data move, because I'm really thinking about the concerns with personal data here. Sometimes it's copied rather than moved, and sometimes it's replicated for availability or integrity. Sometimes for proper technological reasons you're using 2 or 3 copies for load balancing, etc. The more you look at it, the more you have duplication, technical desire and need to move data quickly, perhaps through technological means rather than human means. And so the realities of the data location is that it can be very, very complicated. Locations may be multiple and may change, as I've just indicated. There may be, for example, on the far right-hand side of the top, using a cloud model, the physical location may not necessarily need to be known, simply required that the data controller will control the location of the data. The fact that you are in the EEA does not necessarily guarantee protection of itself. You've got to think about data sovereignty, encryption and where it is and where it isn't, and then you've got more far-flung possibilities such as hosting data in barges in international waters, data being in drones flying over regulated airspace. You can spin the theories. But why is this all relevant? Well, you need to know where your data should be to know if it's lost. Sometimes. You need to identify which regulators you need to deal with, and of course the regulators are still jurisdictional bound, which is actually most of the problem perhaps. And thirdly, each legal jurisdiction may have a different approach, either locally, just generally under their local laws, or secondly, as to whether data can be moved offshore with or without jumping through hoops. And then you need to know whether you are dealing with personal data and whether your people actually understand whether the data is personal data or is it properly anonymized. So if you replace phone numbers with dummy values, that can be properly anonymizing, or it can't be, depending on what dummy values you use and how you choose those dummy values. If you randomly replace phone numbers, then that's probably okay. It's no longer personal data. But if you generate unique identifiers, you actually still probably create personal data. Encryption is great, but doesn't make it not personal data. Tokenization, randomization, it all depends on the facts. And generally, the technological response is not necessarily driven by a full understanding of whether or not something is going to be personal data at the end of it. It may be good in security terms, but may not be good in terms of depersonalizing the data. And this can matter enormously when you are fronting up in the first day or two after a breach, and your CEO is trying to answer questions which are plainly put and not easily capable of a straight answer. You've got to work out those answers up front. So that is an area of complexity, I would say. So when the worst happens, how do you manage it? Well, again, it's all to do with drilling through these processes. And you can see that the step plan I'm indicating, it's not rocket science. It's to do with prioritization, not panicking, mobilizing the relevant team, and gathering together all of the facts, the new facts and the underlying substrate of what should be there, and getting the investigation team together, engaging lawyers, of course, forensic people, PR, credit monitoring services, which may be close to hand in many of your cases, and stopping the problem. You know, it may be you turn off the system, pull the plug out. I mean, that may very well be things that you should be doing at minute 10 rather than next night. You need to assess the impact and the consequences, respond with your previously produced incident response plan, and then start to notify. Probably best not to notify too early, i.e. the first day, but you need to have your time bomb is running, and the risks increase with the longer that you sit on your problem. But you do need to evaluate. And the time to notification is not, there's no silver bullet. You need to model this, and you need a bit of touchy-feely response depending on what it is that you find that you're dealing with. Now, on top of all of this technical stuff and process and crisis management, you have reputation. And Deloitte and various others will have said something similar to this, although the percentages are really quite striking. 87% of executives rate reputation risk as more important than other strategic risks. And 88%, not sure who the 1% is who's doing something different, executives say their companies are explicitly focusing on managing reputation risk. So with this in mind, how do you deal with your customers and how do you deal with your regulators? Now, in terms of notification, of course the cyber attacks often trigger intense scrutiny from regulators, and tough decisions need to be made about notifying those who are potentially affected. And that's, on one level, on the legal level, the strict legal position as to whether or not a notification is required is fragmentary, because most laws are driven by local considerations, historical local considerations. There's no, at the moment, certainly no global or even no blocked approach to notification requirements. Notification in the US is generally coming together, and in the EU it's about to solidify. The EU data protection regulation, expected in 2016, is likely to impose mandatory notification of breaches with stringent penalties for non-compliance. And what is touted is up to 2% of global annual turnover as a penalty, which is the sort of number that gets people sacked very quickly. Regulators' positions are hardening, and so a strict legal approach is generally nice to have, but not determinative of how you actually deal with it. Often, social media takes it all out of your hands, and you, if you're not careful, are going to be dealing with a reactive position rather than a thought-out, proactive statement. Alongside all of this, evidence needs to be preserved. So some current examples, just from this week really. TalkTalk, the British mobile phone operator, last week suffered a massive cyber attack. Without going into the details, essentially TalkTalk was already on the back foot. It already had, there were some market doubts as to its competitive position against the larger operators. It shed 20% of its valuation immediately after the hack. What it said in the last 48 hours is going to take a tough line on compensation, only compensating people on a case-by-case basis, and only if loss is proven. Now, the valuation went up by 15%, so you would say, oh, well, I saved the day. But of course, there are commentators who are saying, and I think quite rightly, that it puts the future of the company in doubt. Of course, the board members themselves were seen, I think, as being not as prepared as they might be. And the possibility is, or likelihood perhaps, is that customers will drift away from a company which was already seen as perhaps a weaker player. But if they're thinking, well, I'm not going to get any compensation without any an argument, these people are not the sort of people that I need to be doing business with. Another example is Morrison's, the UK supermarket. This is a historical problem, but one which is still rumbling for them. There was a release of personal information of 100,000 staff members, and this was an intentional act by a senior executive who was subsequently jailed for 8 years for posting online staff financial and many other elements of details of the personal details of the staff. Now, this week more than 2,000 current and former employees are pursuing a court claim against the supermarket for breaches of privacy, confidence and data protection law. Whether or not that will be successful remains to be seen, but in reputational terms, Morrison's is struggling. With 100,000 staff, 2,000 and counting. I mean, there'll be more than 2,000 by the time this gets to court. So a very difficult situation for a board where a very senior member of their company exposed them to a difficult hack, and the rumblings go on for a couple of years effectively, all the time impacting reputation. I will end with an example, a bit of a case study from what my firm has been doing in this area. Only one slide. So over 500,000 CVs were stolen from a recruitment agency's database hosted by its outsourced service provider. An organised crime syndicate working with an insider at the service provider perpetrated the attack, intending to sell the stolen personal data on the dark net. Now, undergoing the sort of approaches that I mentioned in the earlier slides. The response, of course, has to be an assessment of the damage. We helped devise a website with FAQs for actively affected individuals. We developed contact centre scripts for those people who are going to deal with the help desk. We helped set up credit monitoring services to individuals affected, worked with forensic advisors, retained to investigate the technical environment, and we liaised with the privacy regulators and the PR team. And we like to think that there was effective crisis management in that particular case. Hopefully, and it was only a helicopter view, that was useful. We are just about on time, and I'm very happy to take questions either now or over lunch.
Thank you very much, Peter. Questions or comments? Tony. Okay, you have the microphone. Okay.
Hello, I have a question about the consumer notification and the continuing popularity we see about consumer notification. Speaking on our own experience in the US, as a credit bureau, we're providing a lot of credit monitoring to notified individuals. But it also seems to me that there's a data breach fatigue, and that there are so many data breaches now that everyone's information has been breached 2 or 3 times. I can't even tell you how many times my information has been breached. And so at some point in time, people think, what does it matter? Why am I being notified? What good does it do? People don't even sign up for credit monitoring in a large percentage. So I'm wondering if you believe policymakers are understanding this data breach fatigue and the essence of what it means to consumers, or whether you think the EU, for example, is going to go headlong into this concept of forcing more and more disclosures, when in fact consumers are numb to it. Just your thoughts on that.
Thank you, that's a very good question. I think that to some extent that describes or explains why there are so many different approaches in different countries to the notification requirement. Many countries took the view that it would be counterproductive, it would be just become a white noise, as you say, of notifications if there was notification legislation. Many others took the view that there should be an attempt to describe a situation where notification should be made in the most important of cases. So either protecting or targeting certain industries or certain values or financial values of data that were going to be exposed, etc., etc. And that has given rise to the complexity because everybody's got a different idea as to what makes sense in their jurisdiction. On the EU front, I'm afraid I have a reasonably jaundiced view. I think it's all part of the big trade war. I think that EU is very good at competition enforcement and data protection enforcement. And in data protection enforcement, it's set up to be better than the US. In everything else, the US is levying bigger fines against foreign organisations, and we'll just see what happens with the emissions issue. But I'm afraid I think it's part of that bigger scheme of things. So I think
may I not completely agree with your view on EU approach to data protection, because just a quick comment. We are finalizing in Brussels the new data protection regulation, and one of the most tricky points is about the right to be forgotten, which is designed because of the regulator is thinking about Google. Then the idea is that anytime I can withdraw my data from Google. What happens for our industry? That you could theoretically, utilizing that principle, withdraw your data this morning, go and applying for a credit line this afternoon, get it, despite the fact that you have you are already over indebted, and then tomorrow release again back to the credit reporting agency your data. Just to make a quick example about the fact that I'm not so sure that in the EU there is a very good understanding of what we're speaking about.
Okay, I think that's a rather different point, but it's it's well made.
No, but due to the fact that Tony made a point about the fact that data breach is a general point, not only relating to cyber data breach, if my understanding is correct. Then we are speaking about protection of consumers, which is something wider than the protection only in case of data, which is a very 0.000% of the cases, if my understanding is correct.
Yeah, I think so, and it seems to me that one of the reasons the U.S. moved toward this notification scheme was that policymakers thought the embarrassment of an entity having to notify their consumers and the media would force better discipline and more investment in data security. Perhaps it has. I think data security is getting better in most cases around most corporate environments, although it's still a big challenge. The point being, you could spend your last dollar on data security and still not have a system that couldn't be breached. So I just wonder if the incentive regarding data breach notification and embarrassment leads to bigger investment is really the equation that this is trying to get at or is helping in any way.
Just finally on that, I think in the US there was an interesting dynamic because after Target and other breaches, there were breaches happening in California where there was a very early notification requirement, and so the individuals were being notified very quickly, and then these breaches were sounding in other states and they weren't being notified because there was no legal requirement to do so. And so these other people who were in touch with their co-consumers in California were finding that A, they didn't know, which they didn't like, and B, they were actually in some cases suffering loss, which nobody liked. And that forced the fairly rapid, over 2 or 3 years, dissemination of this legislation on a state-by-state basis. But there hasn't been a federal response, as I understand it. And that would be perhaps the obvious thing to do. So I always think it's due to local considerations, why personal data laws are developing, and that just gives rise to this massive diversity of responses, which is interesting, but actually very unuseful when it comes to responding to these threats.
Any other questions or comments? Neil?
I saw you've got to hurry up, Enrico, so I'll keep this brief. The TalkTalk example raised a very interesting point because it was a breach, as we know, and there was a consumer reaction where people wanted to cancel their contracts, which brought into this whole concept of, because it's a different type of breach, because it's a long-term contracts, they're mobile phone contracts, broadband, whatever. So I'm just wondering, in your view, whether that might cause a challenge to some contract law around this, because it goes beyond what data protection is saying. It's actually going to start to get some regulators to think about whether it is a breach would cause a contract law, and whether that breach is going to have to start being incorporated. So it's just a future thought. I don't know if you've got any, but
no, that's a good question. I haven't thought about it. I mean, generally speaking, you need to try and use force majeure in those circumstances, and I don't think it's force majeure. So without force majeure, then you would, given that these are standard forms written by the TalkTalk in that case, there's not going to be a way of finding wording to use So it would need to be a regulator who said, this is put you in breach, and we're going to turn you off or turn on your license. It would tend to come from that route, I think. That's my immediate view, not having seen the contracts.
Okay, Peter, thank you very much for your comprehensive and informative speech. Thank you.